Hello, Classics 204. As you may know, I am in San Francisco this week for a conference, and therefore I cannot lecture you in person. However, this is Latin, and of course we don't have time to lose an entire class because I'm gone. And so instead, you are getting a video lecture on Chapter 15. So Chapter 15 takes up basically exactly where we left off at the end of last term. The last thing that we learned last term was the passive voice. We learned the first half of the passive voice last term. The present, the imperfect, and the future tenses. And the reason that we only learned those tenses last term is because those ones are much more similar to their active voice counterparts than the other tenses are. So just to remind you all, if you'll take a look at this slide here, there is the verbs do, teneo, voluo, capio, and invenio, conjugated in the present passive. And then this slide has the same verbs conjugated in the imperfect, and this slide has the same verbs conjugated in the future. You can, of course, pause and take a closer look at those slides if you want, or I have put the slideshow up on Moodle, so you can always go back and take a look at it again. Now, the big difference between the passive voice and the active voice is in what the subject in the sentence is doing. With active verbs, the subject is doing the action of the sentence. The subject is, so with the verb, well, do, for instance, do means I give. And if we have a sentence like, let's say, do casa, I give a house. I am the subject of that sentence, and I am doing the giving. But if we flip that around and if we make that a passive sentence, we could say casa datur, the house is given. The house isn't doing the giving, right? Somebody else is doing the giving. In a passive sentence, the subject of the sentence, instead of doing the action, is receiving the action. It's having the action done to it by somebody else. And there are a variety of reasons to do this. The most common reason to use a passive verb rather than an active is if you want to take the attention, away from whoever is doing the action, and if you want to just make the action seem sort of to be happening, or if you want to focus on whatever's receiving the action instead of the doer of the action. So today's lecture is going to be primarily about the rest of the passive voice. So the perfect, the pluperfect, and the future perfect. And as part of learning this, we will also be learning how to use the fourth principal part. So you've had the fourth principal part, you've had to memorize it ever since week 1 of this class, but you've never had to actually use it before. And this is the class where you start using it. Okay. So the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect are called the perfect system. So we say this is the verbs of the perfect system. All of these verbs in the passive voice are constructed in a fairly similar way, all of these tenses. And there are no, okay, so with the present and the imperfect and the future, as you saw, as you look back at those slides that we're just on, and as you will recall from the end of last term, there are some variations in the different conjugations. So first conjugation verbs, second conjugation verbs, it's stem plus endings. And then with the third and fourth conjugations, the stem, it's not as regular and there are some irregularities involved. That's not the case with the perfect system verbs. With perfect system verbs, there are no irregularities. Every conjugation is conjugated the same way. If a perfect verb is a first conjugation verb, if it's a second conjugation, third IO, or fourth, they're all conjugated the same way. There aren't these weird rules where there are sometimes you use the present stem, but sometimes you use the present stem plus an I. None of that happens in the perfect system. So there are no irregularities in the way that they are conjugated. All right, so let us start with the perfect indicative passive, which you can see on this slide here. So the perfect indicative passive is made in this way. You take the fourth principal part and the present tense of soon. You conjugate soon to match the person and number of the subject. And person and number, that means I, you, he, she, it, we, you plural, or they. The fourth principal part is a participle. For now, you need to know that it functions like an adjective, and the reason you need to know this is because that means it declines fully, and it has to agree in gender, number, and case with the subject of the verb. When it is part of the perfect indicative passive, the participle will always be nominative because it will always be modifying the subject of the verb. But it does decline fully, and there will be times when you will use it in different cases. The fourth principal part declines as though it was a regular first, second declension adjective. So, for instance, the fourth principal part of amo, I love, is amatus, A-M-A-T-U-S. It declines like bonus. So it's amatus, amata, amatu. That's the masculine nominative singular, the feminine nominative singular, and the neuter nominative singular. Amatus, amata, amatu. And it is also plural. So in the plural, it would be amati, and it would end in an I. Amatai, A-M-A-T-A-E, or amata. That's the masculine, the feminine, and the neuter. If no subject, if the subject isn't specified, if it's just it's a third person singular, or it's a first person singular, it's an I or a you, the default to assume is masculine, unless you have a good reason to think otherwise. For Romans, masculine is the default gender for animate subjects. If the verb is plural, so if the subject of the verb is a we or a you plural or a they, then the participle has to be plural because it has to agree in gender, number, and case with with the noun or pronoun that it's modifying, and as those pronouns are plural, therefore the participle will also have to be plural. So how do we translate the perfect active participle? Okay, so let's say we've got these examples which are on this slide here. I'm going to do the first one for you, and then I'm going to ask you to write out and hand in the rest of them for me on Monday or Tuesday, depending which section of this class you're in. Monday if you're in section A, Tuesday if you're in section B. So the first example we have here is captus est. Captus est. Okay, so we would do two things here when we're trying to figure out how to translate this. Est. Okay, we know that est is the third person singular, so that we know that the subject of this sentence is going to be a he, she, it. We can actually narrow that down further though, because we look at captus, and you see the us ending. Well, because captus declines like bonus, bona, bonum, you know that captus, that's masculine singular. So we know it's a he. Okay, so it's a he is our subject. Captus, it's from capio. Capio means capture. If this verb was active with the subject he, it would be he captured. But it's not. It's passive. So instead of he captured, it's he was captured. He is not doing the capturing, he was captured. So when you see the fourth principal part, captus or facta or mixtum, any of those ones that are up there, when you see that plus the present tense of the verb to be, of the verb sum esse fui futurus, that means it is a passive perfect. So we'll have things like amatus, assume would be I was loved. You could also say I have been loved. Okay, so that's the next bit. The next tense that we need to consider is the pluperfect passive indicative. Remember that the pluperfect tense is used for an action that was completed in the past before some other action in the past. So it's not going to be I was loved, it was going to be I had been loved. I had been loved before something else happened. So here is a slide to help explain this, to help illustrate this. The pluperfect is formed very similarly to the perfect. Like I said, these are a system that all goes together. The pluperfect is formed by taking the fourth principal part, that passive participle, and adding the imperfect tense of sum esse fui futurus. So as you can see up on the board, or up on the slide, we have got, sorry, the slide's this way. We have got eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratus, erant. So for instance, if you wanted to conjugate amo in the pluperfect indicative passive, and we're going to assume a masculine subject, it would be amatus eram, I had been loved. Amatus eras, you singular had been loved. Amatus erat, he had been loved. Amati eramus, note that I made the participle plural, amati. Amati eramus, we had been loved. Amati eratis, you plural had been loved. And amati erant, they had been loved. As with the perfect, you conjugate eram to match the person and number of the subject of the verb. Okay. So the example for the pluperfect indicative passive. How do we go about translating something like this? I will do the first one for you, but then again, I would like you to translate these for me and hand them in on Monday or on Tuesday, depending on your section. Dictum erat, that is our first example. The first thing we want to do is figure out the subject. So we look at erat, and we know that's a third person singular. The T tells us that. Okay, so we know it's a he, she, it. And then we move to dictum. We look at the ending of dictum, it's um. And because we know this must be a nominative, that means we know that this is neuter. Dictum erat, the subject is it. If this was an active verb in the pluperfect, it would be it had said, but it's not active, it's passive. So we don't want the it to be doing the same. We want the it to have been said by somebody else. And that means the translation is it had been said. Now we're going to move on to the future perfect passive indicative. Remember that the future perfect tense is used to express an action that will be completed in the future before something else happens in the future. I will have bought the cake before I shall go to the party. For the passive voice, this tense is constructed by taking the fourth principal part and adding the future of the verb sum esse fui futurus. So that means the fourth principal part, like for instance amatus, plus ero, eris or erit, and then in the plural, amati, plus erimus, eritis, and erunt. Again, you conjugate the arrow to match the person and number of the subject of the verb. So if the subject is you singular, you're going to use eris, for instance. And again, the participle must match the subject in gender and number. So if I am speaking, if I want to say I was taught, I'm going to say docta. Sorry, not I was taught, I will have been taught. I will say docta arrow, D-O-C-T-A, because I'm female. But if I was male, I would say doctus arrow. Here we have another slide with examples. And again, I will translate the first one for you, and then I'd like you to hand in the translations of the rest. So the first one is aedificatum erit. Aedificatum erit, again, we want to figure out what the subject is first. Erit, that's a third person singular. Aedificatum, that's a neuter. The um is a neuter. So the subject is it. Aedificatum erit, it will have been built. That is the translation of that. Finally, for the perfect passive system, we have the perfect passive infinitive. So remember that we already had a present passive infinitive. That is the infinitive where for the first, second, and fourth conjugations, you take the active infinitive, like amara, for instance, and you get rid of the final E and replace it with an I. So amara becomes amari. Habera becomes haberi. Audira becomes audiri. For the third conjugation, there's a slightly different rule. For third conjugation, present infinitive passives, you take off the ere. So with fakara, for instance, you would take off ere, or with dukara, you get rid of ere, and you replace it with an I. So dukara becomes duki. Fakara becomes faki. For the perfect passive infinitive, there are no variations depending on conjugation. As with the other perfect passive stem verbs, the conjugations are all the same. All have the same rule. For the perfect passive infinitive, you take the fourth principal part, like for instance, amatus or doctus, and you add essa. So amatus essa, to have been loved. Doctus essa, to have been taught. The participle must agree in gender, number, and of course case with the subject. It's always going to be nominative so far, but it could be feminine, it could be masculine, it could be neuter, and it could be singular or plural, depending on the subject of the main verb of the sentence. The uses of the infinitive that you know so far are going to keep the participle nominative. We don't have any way of using the infinitive at this point that would require the case of the participle to change. So here are some examples. These are complementary infinitives. All of them are complementary infinitives. So again, I will do the beginning one. Debeo audita essa. When you have a sentence like this, the first thing you should always do is look for the main verb and then figure out what the subject of the main verb is, and then go from there. So we have our main verb is debeo. That we know it's the main verb because it's the only conjugated verb in the sentence. Audita essa, that's an infinitive, so it can't be the main verb. So debeo, that O at the end tells us that the subject is I, and of course this is also present and indicative and active. So debeo is I ought, or I should. We know that debeo often takes a complementary infinitive to explain whatever it is that you should do. So debeo audita essa. Audita essa is a perfect infinitive passive, and it comes from the verb audio, which is hear. It's passive and it's an infinitive, so it is to have been heard. I ought to have been heard. The fact that audita ends in A tells us that the I, who is the speaker of this sentence, as the subject of this sentence, is feminine. So the main verb is active, the infinitive is passive. That's fine, you can do that. You can mix up actives and passives between your main verbs and your infinitives. That's fine. So if you could please do the rest of these examples again and hand them in to me at the next class, that would be great. All right, so that is that for new passive forms. I'm sure you have many questions, and of course, were this an actual class? It is an actual class. Were this a class where I was there, I would have stopped many times to address your questions. I can't do that, but what I can do is urge you to rewind, go back, listen to things you didn't understand over again, go through all the examples in the book, and then if you still have other questions after doing all that, you can send me an email, or I am going to work on setting up some basically like online office hours when you can ask me questions. Okay. So I will be trying to set up some online office hours. I will inform you of that by message through Moodle once I have got them set up. If there is no way for me to do that through Moodle, then you'll just have to email me or talk to me next week. There will be ample time for questions about the perfect system, the perfect passive system next week. The last thing to think about for the perfect, for the passive voice is how this changes linking sentences. And here is a slide. There is a slight effect on linking sentences because of the passive voice. In the active voice, the only verb that we can use at this point for linking sentences is sum esse fui futurus. So a linking sentence is something like, the boy is a poet. Boy and poet are the same person, they're both nominative. Boy, puer, is, est, poet, poeta. Boy and poet are both nominatives, they're on either side of the linking sentence, and the est in the middle links them. A number of passive verbs can also appear in linking sentences. Any verb that could introduce a factitive sentence pattern in an active, when it's active, can be a verb in a linking sentence pattern when it's passive. What do I mean by this? Okay, so let's think about a factitive sentence. Let's say, let's go, I make the boy a poet. I make the boy a poet. Facio, puerum, poetam. I make is our verb that can introduce a factitive sentence because it is a verb that changes something from one thing to another thing. Boy is accusative, puerum, because it's the direct object of the factitive verb. And then poetam is our object complement. It's the thing the boy gets made into. So we can take a factitive sentence, we can flip it around, and we can make it a passive linking sentence. And what that would be in English is, the boy is made a poet, which does make a certain amount of sense, right? I mean, is made is basically taking the position of is in the linking sentence pattern. Boy and poet are still the same person. They still have to be the same case, just like they have to be the same case in the factitive sentence because they're the same person. But now that the boy is the subject of the sentence, they both have to be nominatives. So we would say poeta, we would say puer, boy, is made. So that's a present tense verb, it's passive, it's facio, the boy is the subject, so it's going to be third person singular. Present indicative passive, that would be facitur. The boy is made. So, going back to where I was. Boy is our subject, puer. Our verb is made, facitur, third person singular, present, indicative, passive, facitur. And then poet. The poet and the boy are the same person, right? They're the same thing. And so poet needs to be nominative, just like boy is nominative. So we have puer, facitur, poeta. The boy is made a poet. So that means that verbs like facio, creo, what other verbs mean? Oh, the various verbs that mean elect. Any of those verbs that you could use in a factative sentence, you can use as a linking verb in a passive sentence. All right, so that's the end of new material for the passive voice for this class. We do have a couple of other things to cover before I finish up this lecture though, and those things are possessive adjectives and a new kind of ablative. So here is our slide for possessive adjectives. You already know the first and second person ones. Meus, mea, meum, which means my. Tuus, tua, tuum, which means your in the singular. Noster, nostra, nostrum, which means our. And wester, westra, westrum, which means your plural. There is one, so those possessive adjectives can be reflexive or not. What does this mean? Okay, so remember back at the end of last term, we learned about reflexives. We learned about the difference between saying, I like him and he likes himself, or I like me and, okay. A reflexive adjective has to be referring back to the subject of the sentence. So if I say I like myself, or I guess I love myself in Latin, I'm going to say amo me, I love myself. Me can also just mean me. So if you want to say he loves me, amat me. It only becomes reflexive when it is referring back to the subject of the sentence. In the third person, so he, she, it, they, the reflexive pronoun is different from the regular pronoun because there isn't any other kind of third person pronoun. So the pronoun se, se, which means himself, herself, itself, or themselves, can only be reflexive. If you want to say he likes himself, or he loves himself, amat se. But if you want to say I love him, you can't say amo se, because that doesn't make any sense, because se cannot be referring back to the subject in that sentence. It doesn't make any sense. So the same rule applies to these possessive adjectives. The ones for the first and second person can be reflexive or they cannot be reflexive. So I could say, for instance, habeo meam cenam. I have my own dinner. And in that example, meum is reflexive because the subject of the sentence is I and it's my own dinner. But in this example, let's say, habet meum cenam. He has my dinner. It's not, meum is not reflexive in that sentence because meum refers to me or I, and the subject of the sentence is he. So it can't be reflexive. There is a third person reflexive possessive adjective. And unlike the first and second person possessive adjectives, the third person one has to be reflexive. It is suus, sua, suum. It declines exactly like meus and tuus. And it is always reflexive. It has to mean his own, her own, its own, or their own. When you just want to say his, her, its, or their without being reflexive, you use the genitive of is, ea, ud. Sorry, is, ea, id. And as you can see on this slide here, this can actually make quite a big difference in meaning. So here I have two sentences, which are very similar. Wir amat suam uxorum, and wir amat eius uxorum. But the use of the reflexive in the one sentence and a non-reflexive in the other sentence makes a very big difference, well, makes a rather different connotation, shall we say, for the sentences. Because the first one, wir amat suam uxorum, means the man loves his own wife. Okay. But the second one, wir amat eius uxorum, means the man loves his wife or the wife of that man, and it has to mean that he loves somebody else's wife. Wir amat eius uxorum, eius can't be referring to wir. It can't be referring to the subject of the sentence. So, well, the second one, or the first example, is a perfectly reasonable thing to say for a Roman. The man loves his own wife. The second one is quite scandalous. The man loves somebody else's wife. So it's very important to know whether you're using a reflexive or not when you are writing Latin sentences, or you could be unintentionally saying something very scandalous about the Roman you were referring to. All right. So the final new piece of grammar is right here. It's the ablative of specification. It is more commonly called an ablative of respect. And what it does, it's used to make an action or a characteristic more specific, which is why it's called of specification. It answers the question with respect to what or in what way. And you translate your ablative of specification. You begin with in. So if you want to say, let's say honore, honor was your ablative of specification, you would translate that as in honor or with respect to honor. It's often found with dignus or indignus to clarify precisely how somebody or something is worthy or unworthy. So for instance, vir est dignus honore. The man is worthy with respect to honor, or deserving with respect to honor. This is an ablative use with no preposition. Okay, so that is everything for today. Here is one last slide with vocabulary notes. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that civis can be masculine or feminine. It basically just depends on whether the citizen you're talking about is masculine or feminine, is male or female. One word that I wanted to make sure you understood the connotations of is Rus. So Rus, the book says it's country and then it has side in brackets, so the countryside. It's not the same as patria or terra or any of the other words you might know that mean country. Rus means the country as in like the rural areas of the world, as opposed to the city. So Rus really means rural, the countryside. And finally, incendo. With this verb, incendo, which can mean I burn or I set on fire, it means that the subject of the verb is setting something else on fire. So if you want to say I burn the house or I set the house on fire, I burn the house. Incendo casam. But if you want to say the house is burning, you can't use this verb. You have to use a different verb, which you will learn in chapter 16. Okay. So that is everything I have for you today, or for chapter 15. I hope this was useful. I guess we will find out how useful it was next week when you come to class. I am going to give you a little bit of homework besides the examples that I asked you to work through. So for Monday, if you are in section A, or for Tuesday, if you're in section B, please do exercises 117, 121, and 124. 117, 121, and 124, as well as translating all of those examples that I gave you for using the passive voice in the slideshow for this lecture, which you can find either by rewinding this video or probably more easily by taking a look at the slideshow that I have put on Moodle. Okay, I will see you next week when I get back, and I hope you all have a nice weekend, and I will see you soon. Goodbye.